The Cult of Creativity, a surprisingly recent history by Samuel W. Franklin is a sharply observed, deeply researched story about how the modern obsession with creativity came to dominate our personal, professional, and cultural lives. Far from being an eternal human value, Franklin reveals that our current understanding of creativity, framed as a kind of mystical, individual genius, is a relatively recent invention, shaped by Cold War politics, corporate needs, educational reforms, and a shifting definition of the self. His narrative is not just about the history of an idea but about how that idea came to colonize so many corners of modern life. Franklin begins by anchoring the reader in a moment that feels timeless, the cultural saturation of creativity. From schools and job ads to self-help books and startup culture, we're told to be more creative, to value creativity above all, to treat it as both a personal virtue and a professional imperative. But Franklin quickly pulls back the curtain to show that this was not always the case. For most of Western history, creativity was not celebrated in the way it is today. It was even distrusted, associated with chaos, deviance, or the divine. Artists were artisans, not icons. Genius was a rare, often tragic curse, not a corporate goal. He then takes us into the early 20th century, when industrial capitalism and wartime pressures began to shift the landscape. In the wake of World War II, American policymakers and intellectuals became concerned that the conformist pressures of mass production, suburban life, and bureaucratic control were sapping the nation of its imaginative power. The fear wasn't just cultural, it was geopolitical. The Cold War turned creativity into a form of national security. The US had to out-innovate the Soviets, and so it needed a citizenry that could think outside the box. Creativity became a patriotic duty. One of the book's most fascinating chapters explores how psychology and social science disciplines, particularly at institutions like Stanford and the Rand Corporation, began to operationalize creativity. Researchers devised tests, surveys, and experiments to measure creative thinking, often borrowing from intelligence testing but trying to isolate divergent thinking, originality, and spontaneity. These methods were often reductive, but they marked a turning point. Creativity was no longer the domain of poets and painters alone, it was now quantifiable, teachable, and desirable in all areas of life. Franklin narrates how this scientific creativity push filtered into corporate America. Companies like IBM and General Electric began to fund creativity training programs for their employees. Management gurus encouraged executives to embrace brainstorming, idea generation, and creative disruption. Office architecture even changed to support this ethos. Cubicles, whiteboards, and open-concept designs emerged not just for efficiency but to stimulate collaboration and serendipitous thought. The goal was to manufacture creativity the same way companies had manufactured efficiency a generation earlier. Education reform was next. By the 1960s and 70s, creativity became a buzzword in schools. Progressive educators promoted the idea that children were naturally creative and that education should be less about rote learning and more about expression, play, and innovation. While these reforms were well-intentioned and often beneficial, Franklin shows how they also dovetailed with larger social anxieties, the desire to produce future workers who were both flexible and emotionally self-expressive in a rapidly changing economy. Schools weren't just nurturing souls, they were grooming adaptable labor. Franklin doesn't condemn creativity, but he questions the cult around it. He examines how the relentless pressure to be creative can backfire, especially when creativity is framed as a moral or professional obligation. Many people experience this as a form of anxiety or inadequacy. If you're not original, not passionate, not innovating constantly, then you're seen as stagnant or obsolete. In this way, creativity has become a kind of performance, something to be shown, optimized, and evaluated rather than felt or explored on one's own terms. The book also probes the rise of the creative class. A term popularized by Richard Florida, but one that Franklin situates in a longer historical trajectory. He shows how the valorization of creativity has reinforced economic inequality, dividing society into those who innovate and those who perform supposedly uncreative labor. The gig economy, too, is reframed through this lens, marketed as empowering and creative, but often precarious, isolating, and exploitative. Creativity, Franklin argues, is often a mask for economic insecurity dressed up as personal freedom. One of the most compelling threads in the narrative is how creativity became synonymous with identity. In earlier times, what you did for a living didn't need to express your inner soul. But in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, work and identity merged, especially for those in creative industries. Franklin charts the rise of portfolio careers, personal brands, and the belief that your job should reflect your deepest self. While this has empowered some, it's also led to burnout and confusion for others, who feel they must constantly produce not just work but personal meaning. Franklin also brings in the visual culture of creativity. He dissects advertising campaigns, tech branding, and media portrayals that turn creative people into aspirational figures, free-spirited, slightly rebellious, quirky, and always disruptive. This image is seductive but ultimately narrow. It often excludes non-neurotypical, disabled, or working-class creators who don't fit the mold of the high-energy, endlessly productive innovator. The cult, in this sense, has rules: who gets to be seen as creative, and who doesn't. Importantly, Franklin explores the spiritual undertones of modern creativity culture. In a world where traditional religion has lost influence, creativity becomes a kind of secular transcendence. To create is to touch the sublime, to give birth to something bigger than oneself. But this too has downsides. It places enormous pressure on people to find meaning through work and to self-actualize through productivity. Creativity becomes a form of salvation, which makes failure feel existential. Franklin doesn't leave readers in despair. In the final chapters, he invites a more grounded, humane understanding of creativity, one that is embedded in everyday life, not just elite culture. He talks about craft, care, collaboration, and the slow, imperfect processes of making things in community. True creativity, he argues, is not about novelty for its own sake or marketable originality. It's about connection, exploration, and persistence. In this sense, creativity is not something you either have or don't, it's something you do, often quietly, often with others, often without applause. He calls for a redemocratization of creative labor, valuing the contributions of those whose work may not be glamorous or disruptive but is nonetheless generative. A nurse improvising in crisis, a parent inventing bedtime stories, a maintenance worker solving unexpected problems, all of these are acts of creativity too. By widening the definition, Franklin hopes we can soften the pressures of the cult and rediscover the communal, even spiritual dimensions of making and imagining. In the end, the cult of creativity is not an attack on the idea of creativity itself, but a critical unraveling of how it has been rebranded, sold, and weaponized in late capitalist society. Franklin tells this story with empathy and clarity, urging us to step outside the narrow frameworks we've inherited. Creativity, he reminds us, does not belong to corporations, tech founders, or gifted children alone. It belongs to everyone, and reclaiming it may mean unlearning what we've been told it should look like.